It doesn't happen when you swipe your card. It doesn't happen when you click Buy Now. It happens a few seconds before that. A quiet, almost invisible moment where emotion makes the decision and logic simply signs the receipt. That is where your money really disappears. Not in the store, not online, not in your bank account, but in your emotional state. And if you don't learn to see that moment, you will keep earning more, yet feeling like you have less. Welcome to this audiobook, The Emotional Spending Trap. In this journey, you are not just going to learn how to save money. You're going to learn why you lose it. Not mathematically, but emotionally. Because here's the truth most people avoid. You don't spend money because you need things. You spend money because you feel something. And until you understand that, nothing changes. In this audiobook, you will discover the hidden psychology behind your spending habits, the emotional triggers that quietly drain your income, and the exact internal shifts required to finally take control. We will break this journey into chapters. You will uncover why high earners still feel broke, how stress, boredom, and even success push you into spending, how your environment is designed to manipulate your decisions, and most importantly, how to build emotional discipline so your money finally starts working for you instead of against you. Because this is not about budgeting. This is about awareness. This is about control. This is about freedom. And here's a line I want you to remember from the very beginning. You don't have a money problem. You have an emotional pattern. This audiobook is not financial advice. It is a deep psychological exploration designed to help you understand your behavior and make better decisions. And if you stay with me until the end, you will not look at money the same way again. Because the real trap is not how much you earn. It's how you feel when you earn it. And that brings us to the first truth. The moment you think you deserve it is the moment you lose it. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Invisible Transaction. There is a story happening every time you spend money, but you don't see it. You only see the surface, the product, the price, the purchase. What you don't see is the emotional exchange happening underneath. A long day at work, a stressful conversation, a feeling of being behind, a moment of boredom late at night, and suddenly your brain starts whispering, you deserve something. Just this once. It's not that much. And in that moment, the transaction has already happened. The money leaving your account is just the confirmation. This is what behavioral experts have been pointing out for years. People don't make purely rational financial decisions. They react in the moment, often framing each decision as isolated instead of seeing the bigger pattern. And that's where the trap begins. Because when you treat every purchase as separate, you never see the pattern forming. You never see the loop. You never see the identity being built. You only see one small decision. But your life is not shaped by one decision. It is shaped by repeated emotional reactions. Think about it. How many times have you told yourself, this won't matter. It's just a small reward. I'll fix it later. And yet, later never comes. Because the problem is not the purchase. The problem is the permission. The moment you give yourself emotional permission to spend, you reinforce the behavior. And the more you reinforce it, the more automatic it becomes. Until one day, you are no longer deciding. You are reacting. That's the trap. Not poverty, not low income, reaction. Because there are people earning thousands tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands every month, and still feeling broke. Not because they don't earn enough, but because their emotional spending grows with their income. More stress, more spending, more success, more spending, more pressure, more spending. It scales. And here's what most people don't realize. Spending is not just about buying things. It's about regulating emotions. You feel low, you spend. You feel high, you spend. You feel stuck, you spend. You feel successful, you spend. Different emotions, same action. And the brain starts connecting spending with relief. Relief from stress. Relief from boredom. Relief from insecurity. Relief from feeling behind. And once that connection is built, you are no longer managing money. You are managing emotions through money. That's a dangerous system because emotions are unpredictable. And when your financial behavior depends on unpredictable emotions, your results become unstable. That's why some months you feel in control, and other months everything falls apart, not because your income changed, but because your emotions did. Let that sink in. Your bank account is not just a financial record, it's an emotional history. Every transaction tells a story, not about what you bought, but about what you felt. And if you start reading it that way, everything changes, because now you're not asking, what did I spend? You're asking, why did I feel the need to spend? That question alone can change your life. But most people never ask it, because it's easier to blame numbers than face emotions. It's easier to say, I need a better budget, than to admit, I don't control my impulses. And that's where awareness begins, not with restriction, but with honesty. So let me ask you something. The last time you made a purchase you didn't need, what were you feeling? Stress, boredom, loneliness, pressure, celebration? Be honest. Because that answer is more important than the price of the item. And once you start noticing this pattern, you'll realize something uncomfortable. You were never buying the product. You were buying the feeling, and feelings don't last, which means the satisfaction doesn't last, which means the cycle continues. Spend, feel relief, feel empty, spend again, over and over until you break it. But breaking it requires something most people avoid. Pause. That small moment before the purchase, that invisible gap. That's where control lives, and if you can learn to expand that gap, even by a few seconds, you begin to take your power back. Because in that gap, you can ask, is this solving something or escaping something? That question will expose everything, and most of the time, the answer will make you uncomfortable, because you'll realize you're not building a life, you're managing emotions, and money is just the tool you've been using to do it. But here's the good news. Once you see the pattern, you can change it. Once you understand the emotional trigger, you can interrupt it. Once you become aware, you are no longer trapped, and that is where transformation begins. But awareness alone is not enough, because the system around you is designed to keep you emotional, to keep you reactive, to keep you spending. And in the next chapter, you're going to see something most people never notice. You're not just fighting your own emotions. You're fighting an entire environment built to amplify them. And once you see it, you'll never walk into a store or open an app the same way again. Dear viewer, we now have over 150 videos on our channel. That's a huge number, and we want to thank you, our viewers and subscribers, so much for that. You inspire us to create great videos every time and choose the best topics for our audiobooks. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time to do so. We have big plans for this channel. Thank you. Chapter 2. The Engineered Temptation. You think you're making decisions freely. You think you walk into a store, scroll through an app, browse a website, and choose what you want. But what if I told you most of your spending decisions were influenced long before you even arrived? Because the truth is, you are not just dealing with your emotions. You are walking through systems designed to amplify them. Every color, every sound, every notification, every limited time offer, every only 2 left in stock. None of it is random. It's engineered to push you gently, emotionally, towards spending. Think about the last time you opened your phone. You didn't plan to buy anything. You just wanted to check something quickly. And then an ad appeared. Perfect timing, perfect message, something you didn't even know you needed until that moment. That's not coincidence. That's data. Because in 2025, your behavior is tracked, analyzed, and predicted. What you click, what you pause on, what you search, what you hesitate on. All of it is used to understand one thing: what emotional state you're most likely to spend in. And once that state is identified, you are targeted at the exact moment your resistance is lowest. That's the game. And if you don't see it, you will always feel like your spending is random. But it's not. It's triggered. This is what makes the emotional spending trap so dangerous. It doesn't just rely on your weakness. It studies it, and then it feeds it. Because companies don't just sell products. They sell feelings, confidence, status, relief, escape, belonging. And they become incredibly good at connecting those feelings to purchases. You're not buying shoes, you're buying identity. You're not buying a gadget. You're buying convenience and control. You're not buying food, you're buying comfort. And when your brain connects spending with emotional reward, it stops questioning the logic. Because it's no longer a financial decision. It's an emotional solution. That's why willpower alone doesn't work. Because you're not just fighting yourself. You're fighting systems optimized to bypass your logic. Let that sink in. You are being outplayed, not because you're weak, but because the system is designed to be stronger than your awareness. Unless you change the rules. And here's the first rule you must understand. Awareness is your defense. Because once you start noticing the patterns, the triggers begin to lose power. You start seeing the tricks, the urgency, the emotional hooks, the manipulation, and instead of reacting, you observe. That shift from reaction to observation is where control begins. But most people never make that shift. They stay inside the experience. They feel the urge and they follow it. They see the ad and they trust it. They feel the excitement and they act on it without realizing that excitement was designed. That urgency was manufactured. That desire was planted. And once you see that, something changes inside you. You stop being impressed. You start being aware. And awareness breaks illusion. Let me give you an example. You see a message, limited time offer, 50% off, ends tonight. What do you feel? Pressure, urgency, fear of missing out. Now ask yourself, was that urgency real? Or was it created? Because most of the time, the offer comes back. The discount returns. The limited time resets. But your emotional reaction in that moment, that was real. And that's what they're counting on. Your reaction, not your reasoning. Because if you had time to think, truly think, you might decide differently. but they don't want you to think. They want you to feel fast, impulsive, emotional, because emotion moves faster than logic, and speed kills discipline. That's why the modern environment is built around speed. Fast checkout, one-click buying, instant approval, no friction, because friction creates thinking, and thinking reduces spending. So everything is designed to remove that pause, to eliminate that gap, to keep you moving, clicking, buying, reacting, and the faster you move, the less control you have. This is not accidental. This is strategy. And once you understand that, you stop blaming yourself entirely, but you also stop excusing yourself. Because yes, the system is designed to influence you, but you still have a choice. You still have awareness. You still have the ability to slow down. And that is your advantage, because most people never use it. They stay fast, reactive, emotional, predictable, and predictable people are easy to sell to. So the question becomes, do you want to stay predictable, or do you want to become aware? Because awareness changes everything. It doesn't remove temptation, but it weakens it. It gives you space, space to think, space to question, space to choose differently, and that space is where your financial future is decided, not in your income, not in your job, not in your opportunities, but in that small moment between feeling and acting. That's your battlefield. And if you can learn to control that moment, you can change your entire financial life. But there's something even deeper, something most people never realize. Your spending is not just influenced by ads. It's influenced by your identity, who you believe you are and who you're trying to become. Because every purchase is not just emotional, it's personal. And in the next chapter, you're going to uncover one of the most powerful forces behind your spending, the identity you're trying to prove, and why it might be the very thing keeping you stuck. Chapter 3, the identity you're trying to buy. There's a deeper layer beneath emotional spending, a layer most people never question because it feels too personal. But if you're serious about breaking the cycle, you have to go there, because you're not just spending to feel better. You're spending to become someone. Let that sit with you for a moment. Every time you buy something, you're not just choosing an object. You're choosing a version of yourself, a slightly upgraded identity, a story you want to believe. Think about it. Why do people buy clothes they don't need? Why upgrade phones that still work? Why spend money on things that don't actually improve their life long term? It's not about function. It's about identity. It's about how they want to be seen. And even more importantly, how they want to see themselves, because deep down, there is a gap between who you are and who you believe you should be. And spending becomes the shortcut to close that gap. You feel behind, so you buy something that makes you feel ahead. You feel unnoticed, so you buy something that makes you feel seen. You feel average, so you buy something that makes you feel exceptional. But here's the problem. The identity you buy doesn't last because it's not built. It's borrowed. And borrowed identities fade quickly. That's why the excitement disappears. That's why the satisfaction doesn't stick. That's why you need the next purchase, and the next, and the next. Because you're not fixing the gap. You're covering it. And every time you cover it instead of confronting it, the gap grows. This is where the emotional spending trap becomes dangerous. Because now it's not just about money. It's about self-worth. And when your self-worth is tied to what you buy, you will always need more. Not because you're greedy, but because you're searching for a feeling that no purchase can permanently give you. Confidence, belonging, respect, peace. These are internal states, but you've been trained to chase them externally, through products, through brands, through status, and the system reinforces it every day, showing you what success looks like, what confidence wears, what happiness owns, and slowly, you start believing that if you just get those things, you will finally feel complete. But that completion never arrives, because the identity was never real. It was marketed. This is why some of the most financially successful people still feel empty, because they reached the external markers without building the internal foundation. And emotional spending keeps feeding that illusion. It tells you you're one purchase away from becoming who you want to be. But that's a lie, because becoming is not something you can buy. It's something you build, and building requires time, effort, discomfort, consistency, things that spending allows you to avoid. That's why it's so tempting, because buying feels like progress, even when it's not. Let me say that again. Buying feels like progress, even when it's not. You buy books you don't read, courses you don't finish, tools you don't use, clothes for a life you don't live. And for a moment, it feels like you're moving forward, but you're not. You're staying in place, just with less money. Because real progress is not about what you acquire, it's about what you apply. And emotional spending creates a dangerous illusion that acquisition equals growth. But it doesn't. Growth is uncomfortable. Spending is comfortable. And that's why the cycle continues. Because comfort feels good in the moment, but it costs you in the long run. So now the question becomes, who are you trying to become? And more importantly, are you trying to build that person or buy that person? Because those are two completely different paths. One leads to discipline. The other leads to dependency. One creates freedom. The other creates endless need. And most people never realize they're on the second path until they feel stuck, earning more, spending more, yet somehow still searching, still unsatisfied, still chasing something they can't define. That's not a money problem. That's an identity problem. And until you separate your identity from your spending, you will always feel the need to prove something to yourself, to others, to the world. But here's the truth. You don't need to prove anything. You need to build something quietly, consistently, internally, because the strongest identity is not the one you show. It's the one you live. And once you start building that, spending loses its power, because you no longer need it to feel complete. You no longer need it to feel enough. You no longer need it to feel in control. And that's when everything changes. But there's still one more layer, a layer that keeps people stuck even when they become aware, even when they understand their emotions, even when they recognize the patterns. They still fall back into the same behavior. Why? Because of something deeper, something built over years, habits, automatic behaviors that run without thinking. And in the next chapter, you're going to uncover how emotional spending becomes a habit and why breaking it is not about motivation, but about rewiring your system. Chapter 4, The Habit Loop That Keeps You Broke. At this point, you might be thinking, okay, I understand my emotions. I see the triggers. I recognize the identity patterns. So why does it still happen? Why do you still spend when you know better? Because knowledge doesn't break habits. Systems do. And emotional spending is not just a reaction, it's a loop, a pattern your brain has repeated so many times. It no longer asks for permission. It just runs, automatically, effortlessly, silently. And if you don't understand this loop, you will keep blaming yourself for something your brain has already automated. So let's slow this down. Every habit, good or bad, follows a simple structure: trigger, action, reward. That's it. And emotional spending fits perfectly into this system. The trigger? An emotion, stress, boredom, pressure, loneliness, even excitement. The action? Spending, scrolling, clicking, buying. The reward? Relief, a temporary emotional shift, a moment where the discomfort disappears. Now here's where it gets dangerous. Your brain doesn't care about money. It cares about relief. So when it sees that spending creates relief, it locks that pattern in. And the next time you feel that same emotion, it doesn't ask, should we spend? It says, we know what to do. That's a habit. And habits don't need motivation. They don't need logic. They don't need permission. They just run. This is why you can understand everything in this audiobook and still find yourself adding something to your cart at midnight. Because in that moment, you're not thinking, you're executing a pattern, and the more you repeat it, the stronger it becomes, like a path in a forest. The more you walk it, the clearer it gets, the easier it becomes to follow, until one day, it's the only path you see. That's what emotional spending becomes. Not a choice, a default. And here's the truth most people don't want to hear. You didn't accidentally build this habit. You trained it every time you felt something uncomfortable and chose spending as the response. You reinforced it. You told your brain, this works. And your brain listened. Because your brain is always learning, always adapting, always optimizing for one thing: efficiency. So if spending is the fastest way to feel better, that's the route it will take, again and again and again, until you interrupt it. But interruption is not about willpower, because willpower is temporary and habits are persistent. So if you rely on willpower, you will lose, not because you're weak, but because you're using the wrong tool. You don't fight habits with force. You replace them with structure. You change the loop. You keep the trigger. You keep the reward. But you change the action. Let me explain. The trigger will still happen. You will still feel stress. You will still feel boredom. You will still feel pressure. You cannot remove that. And the reward is still needed. Relief matters. You're human. You need emotional balance. But the action, that's where your power is. Because instead of spending, you can choose a different response. Not an easy one, but a better one. And at first, it will feel unnatural, because your brain is used to the old path. But if you repeat the new action enough times, you begin to carve a new path, a stronger one, a more intentional one, and slowly, the automatic behavior shifts. This is how real change happens, not overnight, not through motivation, but through repetition, through consistency, through awareness followed by action. And here's something powerful to understand. You don't need to break the habit completely at first. You just need to slow it down. Create friction. Make the process less automatic. For example, before any non-essential purchase, pause. Just pause. 10 seconds. That's it. In those 10 seconds, ask, what am I feeling right now? Not, do I need this? That's too logical. Go deeper. What am I trying to fix? Because once you identify the emotion, you weaken the habit. You bring awareness into an automatic process, and awareness creates choice, and choice creates change. But most people never pause. They move too fast. They feel and they act. No space, no awareness, no interruption, and that's why the loop continues. So if there's one thing you take from this chapter, let it be this. You are not your habits, but you are responsible for changing them. No one else can do it for you. No system will fix it for you. No increase in income will solve it. Because if the habit stays the same, more money just feeds it. You don't fix emotional spending by earning more. You fix it by becoming more aware and more disciplined in your response. And yes, that requires effort. It requires discomfort. It requires saying no in moments where your brain is screaming yes. But that's where growth lives. Not in comfort, not in ease, but in resistance. So the next time you feel the urge, don't fight it immediately. Observe it, understand it, name it. Because when you can name the emotion, you begin to separate from it. And once you separate, you gain control. But there's something even deeper happening beneath all of this. Something that shapes your habits long before you even realize it. Your environment, the people around you, the culture you live in, the standards you compare yourself to. Because whether you like it or not, your spending behavior is not just personal, it's social. And in the next chapter, you're going to uncover how your environment quietly influences your financial decisions, and why changing your surroundings might be the most powerful shift you can make. Hey there, we want to remind you that we often choose topics suggested by you, our viewers, in the comments. In the comments, you can suggest a topic or ask a question about what you'd like to see in our video. We read every comment carefully, so we promise not to miss a single one. Thank you. Let's keep going. Chapter 5. The Social Mirror That Controls Your Wallet. You like to believe your decisions are your own, that what you buy, how you spend, what you prioritize is purely personal. But look closer, because most of your financial behavior is not coming from within you. It's being reflected back at you from the world around you, from the people you follow, from the lifestyles you observe, from the standards you've silently accepted. This is the social mirror, and it is one of the most powerful forces shaping your spending. Because humans are not isolated thinkers. We are comparative beings. We measure ourselves against others constantly, quietly, automatically, and in today's world, that comparison never stops. You wake up, and before your feet hit the ground, you've already seen someone living better than you, driving something newer, wearing something cleaner, traveling somewhere further, smiling in ways that suggest they figured it out. And you didn't. That's the emotional trigger, not need, not survival, comparison. And comparison creates pressure. Pressure to catch up, pressure to fit in, pressure to not feel left behind. And when that pressure builds, spending becomes the fastest way to respond. You don't think it through. You feel it and you act. Because in that moment, buying something feels like closing the gap, like proving something, like saying, I'm not behind. But here's the truth. You're not closing the gap. You're feeding the illusion, because the life you're comparing yourself to is often incomplete, curated, filtered, strategically presented. You're not seeing the debt behind it, the stress behind it, the trade-offs behind it. You're seeing the highlight and comparing it to your reality. That's not a fair comparison. But your brain doesn't care about fairness. It reacts to perception, and perception drives emotion. And emotion drives spending. That's the loop. This is why people earning similar incomes can live completely different financial lives, because one is spending to match others and the other is building quietly. One is reacting, the other is choosing. And over time, that difference compounds massively, because every emotional purchase made through comparison moves you further away from real stability while giving the illusion of progress. Let me ask you something honestly. How many things have you bought, not because you truly needed them, but because you didn't want to feel less than someone else? Be real, because that answer will show you how much influence your environment has over you. And here's the uncomfortable truth. If you don't control your environment, it will control you. Not aggressively, not obviously, but subtly, through repeated exposure, through normalization, through silent pressure, because what you see every day becomes what you believe is normal, and what you believe is normal becomes what you try to match. That's why someone surrounded by luxury feels poor with a decent income, and someone surrounded by discipline builds wealth with the same income. It's not just about money, it's about perspective. And perspective is shaped by environment. This is why people who truly change their financial life don't just change their habits. They change what they see, what they consume, who they listen to, because they understand something powerful. You cannot build a disciplined financial life in an environment that constantly promotes emotional spending. It's like trying to stay calm in a room designed to keep you anxious. You can try, but it's harder than it needs to be. So what do? You become intentional. You start filtering your environment, not completely, but consciously. You ask yourself, is this influencing me to grow or to spend? Is this making me think or react? Is this building discipline or feeding comparison? Because every piece of content you consume is shaping your decisions, whether you notice it or not. And once you realize that, you stop consuming blindly. You start choosing carefully, because you understand that your attention is valuable, and wherever your attention goes, your behavior follows. This is not about avoiding the world. It's about seeing it clearly. It's about recognizing the game without getting lost in it. Because once you see the social mirror for what it is, it loses its power. You stop chasing, you stop proving, you stop reacting, and you start building quietly, intentionally, without needing validation. And that's where real freedom begins. Not when you have more money, but when you stop needing to show it. But there's still something deeper. Because even when you remove comparison, even when you control your environment, even when you understand your habits, there's one emotion that still drives people to spend more than anything else. Stress, pressure, mental overload. Because when your mind is overwhelmed, your discipline weakens, and your need for relief increases. And in the next chapter, you're going to understand why stress is one of the biggest drivers of emotional spending, and how learning to manage it might be the most important financial skill you ever develop. Chapter 6. Stress Spending. The Silent Leak. There is a version of you that doesn't care about budgets, that doesn't care about long-term goals, that doesn't care about saving, investing, or planning. And that version shows up when you're stressed. Not slightly uncomfortable, not mildly distracted, but mentally overloaded, emotionally drained, pushed to the edge of your capacity. That's when the rules change. Because Stress does something powerful to the brain. It narrows your focus, it reduces your patience, it weakens your discipline, and most importantly, it increases your desire for immediate relief. Now think about that. If your brain is overwhelmed and it's searching for the fastest way to feel better, what's the easiest option available in modern life? Spending? One click, one purchase, one small escape, no effort, no delay, no resistance. And in that moment, it feels justified. Because your brain is not thinking long term. It's thinking survival. How do I feel better right now? That's the question stress asks. And emotional spending answers it quickly. That's why some of your worst financial decisions don't happen when you're calm. They happen when you're overwhelmed. After a long day, after a difficult conversation, after a moment where you feel like you've lost control. Because in those moments, spending feels like control, like relief, like a reset. But it's temporary, and temporary solutions create permanent patterns. This is where the trap becomes invisible, because you're not spending for pleasure, you're spending for relief. And relief feels necessary, it feels justified, it feels like something you deserve. But here's the reality. Relief is not the problem. How you get it is. Because if your default response to stress is to spend, then stress becomes expensive. Every bad day costs you, every overwhelming moment drains you, and over time, that adds up in ways you don't even notice. Small purchases, frequent decisions, emotional reactions, all stacking quietly, until you look back and wonder, where did my money go? It didn't disappear, it was exchanged for moments of relief. But those moments didn't solve anything. They just delayed the discomfort. And when the discomfort returned, you repeated the pattern. That's the loop. Stress to spending to temporary relief. To stress returns to spend again. And unless you break that loop, it will follow you no matter how much you earn. Because stress doesn't disappear with income. In fact, for many people, it increases. More responsibility, more expectations, more pressure to maintain a lifestyle. And if your coping mechanism stays the same, more income just fuels more emotional spending. That's why some people feel more financially trapped after they start earning more. Because their stress grows faster than their discipline, and spending becomes their escape. But here's the shift you need to make. You don't eliminate stress. You replace your response to it. Because stress is part of life. You will feel pressure. You will feel overwhelmed. You will have moments where everything feels heavy. That's normal. What's not normal is letting those moments control your financial behavior. So what do you do instead? You build alternative relief systems, healthier ones, slower ones, more intentional ones, because your brain still needs release. It still needs a way to process emotion. But it doesn't have to cost you money. It can be movement, a walk, a workout. It can be stillness, silence, breathing. It can be expression, writing, talking, reflecting. It can be discipline, doing something hard instead of something easy. Because here's the truth. The strongest people are not the ones who avoid stress. They are the ones who respond to it differently. And that difference changes everything. Because once your brain learns that relief can come from something other than spending, the loop begins to break. Slowly, gradually, but powerfully. And at first, it will feel uncomfortable. Because you're removing an easy escape. You're forcing yourself to sit with emotions instead of numbing them, and that's not easy. But it's necessary. Because emotional control is the foundation of financial control. Without it, no strategy works, no budget holds, no plan lasts, because in the moment of stress, you will always return to your default behavior. So your goal is simple. Change the default. Train your mind to pause, to recognize the feeling, to choose a different response, not perfectly, but consistently. Because consistency builds strength, and strength creates stability, and stability creates freedom. But there's another layer to this, because stress doesn't just come from life. It comes from something even more subtle, something most people ignore: their relationship with time, the feeling of being behind, the pressure of not doing enough, the constant sense that you're running out of time and trying to catch up. And that feeling, that invisible pressure, drives more emotional spending than you realize, because when you feel behind, you try to buy your way forward. And in the next chapter, you're going to uncover how your perception of time is quietly influencing your financial decisions, and why slowing down might be the most powerful move you can make. Chapter 7, The Illusion of Being Behind. There is a pressure you carry that you rarely name. It's not loud. It doesn't scream, but it sits quietly in the background of your life, pushing you, rushing you, making you feel like no matter what you do, it's not enough. That pressure is the feeling of being behind. Behind in life, behind in success, behind in money, behind in where you should be. And whether you realize it or not, this feeling drives a massive amount of emotional spending, because when you feel behind, you don't just want progress, you want speed. You want shortcuts, you want to catch up fast. And spending feels like the fastest way to do that. You buy things that make you look ahead. You invest in things that promise quick results. You upgrade your lifestyle to match where you think you should be, even if you're not ready for it yet. Because the discomfort of feeling behind is too heavy to sit with, so you try to escape it. But here's the truth. You cannot spend your way out of feeling behind, because the feeling is not based on reality. It's based on comparison, expectation, and perception. Think about it. Behind who? Behind what timeline? Behind whose definition of success? Most of the time, you're measuring yourself against standards you never consciously chose: society's expectations, social media timelines, other people's milestones, and you've internalized them as if they are your own. So when you don't meet those timelines, you feel pressure, and pressure creates urgency, and urgency leads to impulsive decisions, including spending, because in that moment, spending feels like movement, like progress, like you're doing something to fix the gap. But you're not fixing it, you're masking it, and the more you try to mask it, the stronger the feeling becomes, because deep down, you know that buying something doesn't actually move your life forward. You know that upgrading your lifestyle without upgrading your foundation is not real progress. And that internal conflict creates even more stress, which leads to more spending. That's the cycle. Feeling behind leads to spending to catch up, leads to temporary relief, leads to deeper awareness, leads to more pressure, leads to more spending. And it continues until you question the premise, until you ask, what if I'm not behind at all? What if the timeline you're chasing is not real? What if the pressure you feel is self-imposed? Because here's something most people don't realize. There is no universal timeline for life. There is no fixed age where you must have everything figured out. There is no deadline for success, but the moment you believe there is, you start rushing, and rushed decisions are rarely good decisions, especially financially, because building anything meaningful takes time, wealth, discipline, stability. These are slow processes. They require patience, consistency, long-term thinking, but when you feel behind, you abandon all of that. You want speed, and speed is the enemy of discipline, because when you rush, you stop thinking clearly, you stop evaluating, you stop questioning. You just act. And action without awareness is where emotional spending thrives. So the shift you need to make is simple, but not easy. You need to slow down, not your ambition, not your goals, but your perception of time. You need to detach from artificial timelines and reconnect with your actual path, because your life is not a race, it's a process, and processes cannot be rushed without consequences. So instead of asking, "How do I catch up?" ask, "What am I building?" Because building changes everything. When you focus on building, you stop chasing appearances, you stop reacting to pressure, you stop needing to prove something, and you start making decisions that align with your long-term reality, not your short-term emotions. That's where financial control begins, not in restriction, but in clarity. Clarity about your pace, clarity about your priorities, clarity about what actually matters. Because once you have that, the noise loses its power, the pressure fades, and the need to spend impulsively decreases, not because you're forcing yourself, but because you no longer feel the same urgency. And that's powerful, because urgency is what drives most bad decisions. Remove the urgency, and you regain control. But there's another layer to this, because even when you slow down, even when you detach from timelines, there's still something pulling at you, something that makes you feel like you deserve to spend, even when you know you shouldn't, and that is reward. The belief that after everything you've done, after all the stress, all the effort, all the pressure, you deserve something. And in the next chapter, you're going to understand how the concept of rewarding yourself becomes one of the most dangerous traps in emotional spending, and how to redefine reward in a way that actually moves your life forward. Chapter 8, The Reward Lie. There's a sentence you've told yourself many times, maybe quietly, maybe without even realizing it. "I deserve this." It sounds harmless. It sounds justified. It sounds like self-care, like balance, like a reward for effort. But hidden inside that sentence is one of the most expensive beliefs you can carry, because when "I deserve this" becomes your permission to spend, discipline disappears. Let's slow this down. You worked hard. You dealt with stress. You showed up when it was difficult. You handled things that drained you, and now your mind says, "Get something nice." You've earned it. That's the reward loop. And at first, it feels fair, logical even, because effort should lead to reward. That's how we're wired. But here's the problem. When your reward system is tied to spending, you train your brain to associate effort with consumption. Work leads to spend. Stress leads to spend. Progress leads to spend. And over time, that becomes automatic. You don't even question it. You just follow the pattern. But let me ask you something honestly. If every time you made progress, you rewarded yourself by moving backward financially, is that really a reward? Or is it a disguised setback? Because real rewards should move your life forward, not hold it in place, not drain your resources, not keep you dependent on the next purchase, But emotional spending flips that logic. It makes you believe that spending is celebration, when in reality, it's often compensation. You're not celebrating progress. You're compensating for discomfort. And those are two very different things. Celebration is intentional, controlled, aligned with your goals. Compensation is reactive, emotional, uncontrolled, and most people live in compensation mode while telling themselves it's reward. That's the trap, because it feels good. And anything that feels good in the moment is hard to question, but if you don't question it, you stay stuck, earning, spending, repeating, never actually building. So here's the shift. You don't remove rewards, you redefine them, because your brain still needs reinforcement. It still needs acknowledgement for effort. But the form of that reward must change. Instead of asking, "What can I buy?" start asking, "What actually moves me forward?" Because the most powerful rewards are not consumptive. They are constructive. They build you, strengthen you, move you closer to who you want to become. That could be investing, saving, improving a skill, creating something, taking care of your body, resting with intention, not escape. Because here's the truth. The best reward for discipline is progress, not pleasure. And once your brain starts connecting effort with progress, instead of effort with spending, everything changes. You stop needing external validation. You stop needing constant consumption. You start feeling fulfilled by growth. And growth lasts longer than any purchase ever will. But this requires awareness, because the "I deserve this" voice is subtle. It shows up at the right time, when your guard is down, when you're tired, when you're emotional. And if you don't catch it, it controls you. So the next time that thought appears, pause and ask yourself, do I deserve this, or do I deserve better? Because sometimes the better reward is not what feels good immediately. It's what builds something lasting. And that's where discipline comes in, not as restriction, but as alignment. Alignment between what you want now and what you want long term, because those two things are often in conflict, and emotional spending always favors the present. Always. It says, feel good now, deal with it later. But later always comes, and when it does, you feel it in your finances, in your stress, in your sense of control. So the real reward is not the purchase. It's the decision to stay aligned, even when it's difficult, even when it's tempting, even when your mind is trying to convince you otherwise. That's power. That's control. That's growth. And once you experience that, spending loses its emotional grip, because you no longer need it to feel rewarded. You feel rewarded by who you're becoming, but there's still something deeper, because even when you redefine reward, even when you build awareness, there's one moment that still breaks people, one moment where discipline collapses and emotional spending takes over completely. That moment is when you feel out of control, when life hits hard, when something unexpected happens, when your emotions spike beyond your usual capacity. And in the next chapter, you're going to understand why losing control leads directly to losing money, and how to build stability even when everything around you feels unstable. Dear viewers, write which city you're from. It's interesting to see which corners of the world are watching our videos. Chapter 9, When Control Breaks. There is a moment that no one plans for, a moment where everything feels too heavy, too fast, too much. A moment where your structure collapses, your routines break, your focus disappears. And in that moment, You don't think about discipline. You don't think about long-term goals. You don't think about saving or building or planning. You think about relief. Immediate, simple, accessible. And that's where emotional spending becomes dangerous. Because when control breaks, your brain doesn't look for the best solution. It looks for the fastest one, and spending is always available, always easy, always ready to respond. That's why some of your biggest financial mistakes don't happen when things are stable. They happen when things fall apart, after bad news, after conflict, after loss, after failure, after moments where your emotional state is too intense to manage calmly. Because in those moments, you are not operating from logic. You are operating from survival, and survival thinking is short-term. It says, just get through this, just feel better, just escape for a moment, and spending becomes the tool, not because it solves anything, but because it distracts you. It gives you something to focus on, something to control, something to feel. Even if that feeling is temporary, and temporary feelings are enough when you're overwhelmed. But here's the cost. Every time you lose control emotionally and respond with spending, you reinforce the connection between chaos and consumption. You teach your brain, when things fall apart, we spend. And that becomes your default. So the next time something goes wrong, you don't even realize it. But your behavior follows the same pattern. That's how people end up making the worst financial decisions at the worst possible times. Not because they're careless, but because they're overwhelmed. And overwhelm reduces awareness. It narrows your focus. It removes your ability to step back and think clearly. And in that state, you don't need logic. You need stability. That's the missing piece. Most people try to build discipline without building stability. And without stability, discipline collapses under pressure, because discipline requires energy, focus, clarity, and when you're overwhelmed, those things disappear. So instead of trying to be stronger in those moments, you need to be more prepared, because you cannot rely on your best thinking during your worst moments. Let that sink in. You cannot rely on your best thinking during your worst moments. So what do? You build systems that protect you when you're not at your best. You create boundaries, friction, barriers that slow you down, even when your emotions are pushing you forward. That could be as simple as this. No purchases when you're emotional. No decisions when you're overwhelmed. No quick fixes when things feel out of control. Because those are the moments where mistakes happen. Not small ones, expensive ones. And here's something powerful. You don't need to eliminate those moments. You just need to recognize them, because awareness, even in chaos, creates a small window, a small pause, and that pause is enough to stop, enough to delay, enough to choose differently, and sometimes that's all it takes. Not perfection, not complete control, just a moment of awareness before action. Because once the action happens, the pattern continues. But if you interrupt it, even once, you begin to weaken it. And weakening the pattern is how you eventually break it. But this goes deeper, because losing control is not random. It's often the result of accumulation. Small stresses, small pressures, small emotional weights, building up over time until one day they overflow. And in that overflow, you react. That's why emotional control is not just about moments. It's about maintenance, daily awareness, daily regulation, daily release, Because if you ignore your emotional state, it doesn't disappear, it builds. And what builds without release eventually breaks. So the real goal is not to avoid breakdowns. It's to reduce the intensity of them, to manage your state consistently. So you don't reach the point where control disappears completely. And that's where real discipline is built, not in extreme moments, but in daily habits, daily awareness, daily choices that keep you grounded. Because when you stay grounded, you stay in control. And when you stay in control, your money stays in your hands. But there's one more layer to this. Because even when you build stability, even when you manage your emotions, there is still something quietly influencing your decisions, something subtle, something invisible, your beliefs, the way you think about money itself. Because if your beliefs are flawed, your behavior will always follow. And in the next chapter, you're going to uncover how your beliefs about money shape every decision you make and why changing those beliefs might be the most powerful shift of all. Chapter 10. The Beliefs That Quietly Control You. There is something deeper than habits, deeper than emotions, deeper than environment, something that sits at the core of every financial decision you make. Your beliefs, not what you say about money, but what you truly believe about it. Because your beliefs act like a filter. They shape what you notice. They shape what you ignore. They shape what feels right and what feels wrong. And most importantly, they shape what you do without you even realizing it. This is why two people can earn the same amount, live in the same city, have access to the same opportunities, and still end up in completely different financial situations. Because they don't think the same way about money. One believes money is a tool. The other believes money is a reward. One believes money is something to build. The other believes money is something to enjoy immediately. One sees money as long-term security. The other sees money as short-term relief. Different beliefs, different behaviors, different outcomes. And here's the part most people miss. Your beliefs about money were not consciously chosen. They were absorbed from childhood, from family, from culture, from observation, from the environment you grew up in. Maybe you heard things like, money is meant to be spent. You only live once. If you have it, enjoy it. Saving is for people who are scared. Or maybe the opposite. Money is hard to earn. There's never enough. You have to hold on to every dollar. Both sides can create problems because extreme beliefs create extreme behavior, and emotional spending thrives in those extremes. If you believe money is for enjoyment, you will justify spending. If you believe money is scarce, you might swing between restriction and impulsive release. Because when you feel deprived, you eventually break. And breaking often leads to overspending. That's the cycle. So the question is not, are you good with money? The real question is, what do you believe about money? Because that belief is running everything. Silently, consistently, automatically. And if you don't examine it, you will keep repeating patterns that don't serve you. Let's go deeper. Do you believe that more money will fix your problems? Be honest. Because if you do, you're already in the trap. Because more money doesn't fix emotional spending. It amplifies it. If your habits stay the same, more income just means bigger purchases, more justification, more room to avoid discipline, and eventually, the same feeling returns. Not enough, still searching, still reacting. That's why some people increase their income and still feel financially stuck. Because the problem was never the amount, it was the mindset. And mindset is built on belief. Let me give you a powerful shift. Instead of seeing money as something to spend or save, start seeing it as something to direct. Because money is neutral. It doesn't have emotion. It doesn't have intention. It follows your decisions. And your decisions follow your beliefs. So if your belief is reactive, your money will be reactive. If your belief is intentional, your money will be intentional. That's the difference. And once you understand that, you stop focusing only on behavior and start working on the foundation. Because changing behavior without changing belief is temporary. You might control yourself for a while. You might stay disciplined for a few weeks. But eventually, your old beliefs will pull you back. Because beliefs create comfort zones. And your mind always wants to return to what feels familiar, even if it's not effective, even if it's keeping you stuck. So real change requires discomfort. It requires questioning what you've always accepted. It requires asking, is this belief actually helping me? Or is it keeping me in the same cycle? Because once you challenge a belief, you create space for a new way of thinking, a new way of acting, a new way of living. And that's where transformation begins. Not in restriction, not in forcing yourself, but in understanding yourself. Because when you understand why you think the way you do, you gain control over what you do next. And that control is everything. But here's where it gets even more interesting, because beliefs don't just influence how you spend, they influence how you earn, how you grow, how you see opportunity. Because if you don't believe you can build something greater, you will unconsciously limit yourself, and emotional spending will fill that gap. You'll settle for temporary pleasure instead of long-term growth. And that's the real cost, not just money, but potential. So the goal is not just to stop spending emotionally, it's to upgrade your belief system, to see money as a tool for building, not escaping, to see discipline as freedom, not restriction, to see patience as power, not delay. Because once those beliefs shift, your behavior follows naturally, not perfectly, but consistently, and consistency is what creates real results. But there's still one more piece, because even with the right beliefs, even with awareness, even with discipline, there is still a force that can pull you back into the trap. Something subtle, something that disguises itself as normal behavior. Lifestyle creep, the silent expansion of your spending as your income grows. And in the next chapter, you're going to understand why earning more often leads to spending more and how to break the cycle before it quietly traps you again. Chapter 11, the lifestyle creep that feels like progress. There's a moment that feels like success. You start earning more, not a little, but enough to notice. Your account looks better. Your stress feels lighter. Your options expand. And for a brief moment, you feel like you've made it. But then something subtle begins to happen. Something quiet. Something almost invisible. Your spending starts to grow. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, comfortably, just enough to match your new income. And before you realize it, the gap between what you earn and what you keep stays exactly the same. That's lifestyle creep. And it's one of the most dangerous traps in financial growth, because it doesn't feel like a problem. It feels like progress. You tell yourself, I can afford this now. I worked for this. It's just an upgrade. And individually, each decision seems reasonable, logical, deserved, but collectively, they change everything. Because you're not just increasing your spending, you're resetting your baseline. What used to feel like a luxury becomes normal. What used to feel expensive becomes acceptable. What used to feel unnecessary becomes expected. And once something becomes your new normal, it's very hard to go back. That's the trap, because now you don't feel like you're spending more. You feel like you're maintaining your lifestyle, even if that lifestyle is consuming everything you earn. Let me say that clearly. Lifestyle creep doesn't feel like overspending. It feels like living. And that's why it's so dangerous, because it hides in comfort. It hides in justification. It hides in the idea that growth should look visible, that success should be seen, felt, displayed. But here's the truth most people don't want to accept. Real financial growth is often invisible. It's not in what you show. It's in what you keep. It's in what you build quietly, without needing validation, without needing to prove anything. Because the moment your lifestyle grows at the same speed as your income, you're not advancing, you're maintaining. And maintenance does not create freedom. It creates dependency. You become dependent on your current income to support your current lifestyle, which means any disruption, any change, any unexpected event becomes a threat. And that's not freedom, that's pressure, that's fragility, that's a system that looks strong but breaks easily. And emotional spending plays a huge role in this. Because as your income increases, your emotional triggers don't disappear. They evolve. You don't just spend more, you justify more, because now you have room, more margin, more flexibility, more ability to say, it's fine. And that's where discipline gets tested, not when you have less, but when you have more. Because when you have less, you're forced to think. When you have more, you're tempted to relax. And relaxation without awareness leads right back into the trap. So the real question is not, how do I earn more? It's, what happens when I earn more? Because that's where your habits reveal themselves. That's where your beliefs get tested. That's where your discipline either holds or breaks. And most people never prepare for that moment. They focus on increasing income without building the structure to handle it. And when the money comes, it flows right back out, quietly, consistently, predictably, because the system didn't change, only the numbers did, and numbers alone. Don't create transformation, behavior does. So here's the shift you need to make. When your income increases, your lifestyle doesn't need to follow immediately. Let there be a gap, a space, a buffer between earning more and spending more, because that gap is where wealth is built, not in big decisions, but in consistent restraint, in choosing not to expand your lifestyle just because you can, in resisting the urge to upgrade everything at once, in staying grounded even when your income rises. That's discipline. And discipline at higher income levels is what separates those who build wealth from those who stay stuck. Because it's not about how much you make, it's about how much you keep, how much you direct, how much you protect from your own impulses, and that requires awareness. Because lifestyle creep doesn't announce itself. It doesn't say, hey, I'm taking over your finances. It shows up as small upgrades, small changes, small decisions that feel harmless, until they become your new reality. And reversing that reality is much harder than preventing it. So the goal is not to restrict yourself forever. It's to expand intentionally, to grow your lifestyle. Only when your foundation is strong, only when your habits are stable, only when your decisions are aligned. Because when you grow intentionally, you stay in control. But when you grow reactively, you stay trapped. And emotional spending always pushes you toward reaction, toward immediate expansion, toward visible progress. But real progress is quiet. It's controlled. It's built over time. And once you understand that, you stop chasing upgrades and start building stability. But there's still something deeper. Because even when you control your lifestyle, even when you resist the urge to expand, there is still one place where emotional spending hides the most, where it feels the most justified, where it feels the most invisible. Small purchases, daily habits, things that don't feel significant but add up in ways you don't notice. And in the next chapter, you're going to uncover how small, repeated spending quietly drains your financial future and why the biggest problem is not what you see, but what you ignore. Friend, write your opinion on this topic in the comments. Do you agree with us or not? I'm interested to hear your thoughts. Chapter 12. The Small Leaks That Sink You. Most people think their financial problems come from big decisions. A bad investment, a major purchase, a sudden loss, something obvious, something dramatic. But the truth is far more subtle and far more dangerous, because it's not the big decisions that keep most people stuck. It's the small ones, the quiet ones, the daily ones, the ones that feel too insignificant to matter. A coffee here, a quick order there, a subscription you forgot about, a small treat at the end of a long day. Individually, they don't feel like a problem. They don't trigger guilt. They don't create urgency. They feel normal, harmless, deserved, but collectively, they tell a different story. Because money doesn't disappear all at once. It leaks, slowly, consistently, silently, and by the time you notice it, it's already gone. This is the most underestimated form of emotional spending, not the big impulse, but the repeated micro-decisions. Because these decisions don't require justification. They don't feel emotional, but they are. They are responses to subtle feelings, convenience, boredom, fatigue, routine. You don't even think about them. You just act. And that's what makes them powerful. Because awareness is low and repetition is high. That combination is dangerous. Think about it honestly. How many times have you spent money this week without even remembering why? Not because you needed something, but because it was easy, available, normal. That's the pattern. And here's the part most people miss. Small spending feels invisible because it doesn't challenge your identity. You don't feel like you're making a bad decision. You feel like you're just living your life. But your life is built on those small decisions, not the big ones. Because big decisions happen occasionally, small ones happen daily, and daily behavior shapes your reality. So if your daily behavior includes constant unconscious spending, your financial future is being shaped without your awareness. That's the real problem, not the amount, but the unconscious nature of it. Because what you don't notice, you don't control. And what you don't control controls you. This is why people say, I don't know where my money went. Because it didn't go in one direction. It's scattered across dozens, hundreds of small, unnoticed decisions. Each one justified, each one minimal. But together, they create a pattern, a system, a financial reality that feels confusing because you never saw it forming. This is where emotional spending becomes invisible. It hides in routine, in convenience, in habits that don't feel emotional, but are driven by emotion. You're tired, so you choose the easy option. You're bored, so you seek stimulation. You're distracted, so you act without thinking. Different states, same result. Spending. And because it's small, you don't question it. But small, repeated actions are more powerful than occasional big ones. That's how habits work. That's how patterns form. That's how your financial life is built, without you even realizing it. So the shift here is not dramatic. It's subtle, but powerful. You start paying attention, not obsessively, not with stress, but with awareness. You begin to notice the small decisions. You begin to ask, why am I doing this right now? Not in judgment, but in curiosity. Because curiosity creates awareness, and awareness creates control. You don't need to eliminate every small expense. That's not realistic. That's not sustainable. But you do need to become conscious of them. Because once you see the pattern, you can adjust it. You can reduce it. You can redirect it. And those small adjustments create massive change over time. Because just like small spending adds up, small discipline does too. Saving a little more, spending a little less, choosing intentionally instead of automatically. That's how momentum builds, not through extreme action, but through consistent awareness. And here's something powerful to remember. You don't need to change everything at once. You just need to change what you can see. Because once you see it, you can't ignore it. And once you stop ignoring it, you start controlling it. That's the shift, from unconscious to conscious, from reactive to intentional, from scattered to directed. And that shift changes everything, but there's still one more layer. Because even when you become aware of small spending, even when you start adjusting your habits, there is still something that pulls you back, something that makes you justify decisions, even when you know better. Rationalization, the stories you tell yourself to make emotional decisions feel logical. And in the next chapter, you're going to uncover how your mind creates these justifications and why mastering your internal dialogue is one of the most powerful tools for breaking the emotional spending trap. Chapter 13. The stories that justify everything. There is a voice in your head. That always has an explanation, always has a reason, always has a way to make things feel okay, even when they're not. That voice is not your enemy. But if you don't understand it, it will quietly control you, because every time you make an emotional spending decision, your mind creates a story to justify it, not after, during, in real time. So it doesn't feel like a mistake, it feels like a decision, a reasonable one, a logical one, a deserved one. That's the power of rationalization. It turns emotion into logic. It takes a feeling and wraps it in a story that makes it acceptable. Think about the phrases you've used before. It's not that expensive. I'll make it back. I need this. It's a one-time thing. I've been good lately. Each one sounds harmless, but each one is a doorway, a way for your mind to move past resistance, to remove doubt, to silence that small voice that says, maybe this isn't the right move. Because your brain doesn't like conflict. It doesn't like tension between what you want and what you know is better. So it resolves that tension by changing the story, not the action. That's the key. Instead of stopping the behavior, It justifies it. And once it's justified, you feel comfortable. You feel aligned. You feel like you made the right choice, even if you didn't. That's the trap. Because now, you're not just spending emotionally, you're defending it. And when you defend a behavior, you reinforce it, you protect it, you make it harder to change. This is why awareness alone is not enough. Because even when you recognize the emotion, your mind can still convince you. It can still create a narrative that feels true. And if it feels true, you follow it. That's why mastering your internal dialogue is one of the most important skills you can build. Because the conversation you have with yourself determines the decisions you make, not your knowledge, not your intentions, your internal conversation. So the question becomes, what are you telling yourself in those moments? Are you questioning your impulses, or are you supporting them? Because most people don't realize they are arguing for their limitations. They are building cases for why they should stay in the same pattern. And the mind is very good at building those cases. It uses past experiences. It uses emotions. It uses logic, twisted just enough to support the outcome you already want. And that's why change feels so difficult, not because you don't know what to do, but because your mind is constantly negotiating against you, quietly, persuasively, consistently. So how do you break that? You don't try to silence the voice. You challenge it, you question it, you expose it. Because once you bring awareness to the story, it loses power. Instead of accepting the first explanation your mind gives you, you ask, is this actually true? Or is this just convenient? Because most justifications are convenient. They serve the emotion, not the outcome. They make you feel better now, at the cost of feeling worse later. And if you don't interrupt that pattern, it becomes your default thinking. So here's a powerful shift. Before any emotional spending decision, don't ask, can I afford this? That question is too easy to answer. Your mind will say yes. Instead ask, am I trying to convince myself right now? Because if you are, you already know the answer. You already feel the hesitation. You already sense the conflict. And that's the moment where awareness matters most. Because that's where the decision is still flexible, still changeable, still under your control. But if you ignore that moment, if you let the story take over, the decision is made, and you follow through. So your goal is not to eliminate desire, not to remove emotion, not to become robotic. Your goal is to become aware of the story before it becomes your action. Because once you see the pattern, you can interrupt it, you can pause, you can choose differently, not perfectly, but intentionally. And intention is what separates reaction from control. Because reactive people believe their own stories. Controlled people question them, and that difference changes everything. But there's still one more layer. Because even when you question your thoughts, even when you slow down your decisions, there is still something that can pull you back into the cycle. Something that doesn't come from inside you, but from the world around you. Noise, constant input, constant stimulation, constant distraction. Because in a world where your attention is constantly pulled in every direction, your awareness weakens. And when awareness weakens, emotional spending becomes easier, faster, more automatic. And in the next chapter, you're going to understand how distraction is quietly draining your money and why protecting your attention might be the most powerful financial move you can make. Chapter 14, The Cost of Constant Distraction. There is something draining your money. That has nothing to do with your income, nothing to do with your discipline, nothing to do with your intelligence, and everything to do with your attention. Because in today's world, your attention is under attack. Constantly. Notifications, messages, videos, ads, endless streams of content, all competing for one thing, your focus. And when your focus is fragmented, your awareness weakens. And when your awareness weakens, your decisions become automatic, reactive, emotional. That's where the damage happens. Because emotional spending doesn't need your full attention. It thrives when you're distracted. Think about it. How many times have you bought something while doing something else, scrolling, watching, talking, multitasking your way through the decision, without ever fully stopping to think? That's not accidental. That's the environment you're living in, a system designed to keep you engaged, but not aware, active, but not intentional, because awareness slows you down, and slowing down reduces consumption. So everything is built to keep you moving, fast, reactive, constantly stimulated, and in that state, you don't question your impulses, you follow them. That's the danger of distraction. It doesn't just take your time. It takes your control, because control requires presence. It requires you to be fully aware of what you're doing and why you're doing it. But distraction removes that. It pulls you out of the moment. It splits your focus. And once your focus is split, your decision-making weakens. You become easier to influence, easier to trigger, easier to convert into action, including spending. And here's the part most people don't realize. Distraction doesn't feel harmful. It feels normal. It feels like entertainment, like relaxation, like a break. But beneath that surface, it's training your brain to avoid stillness, to avoid silence, to avoid reflection. And without reflection, there is no awareness. Without awareness, there is no control. So you move through your day, reacting, scrolling, clicking, buying, without ever fully stopping to ask, why? That's the real cost. Not just the money, but the loss of intentionality, the loss of control over your own behavior. Because when your attention is not yours, your decisions are not yours. And that's where the emotional spending trap becomes almost invisible. Because you're not consciously choosing. You're responding to stimuli, to triggers, to input that never stops. And the more input you consume, the less space you have to think. And thinking is what protects you. Thinking creates distance. Distance creates clarity. Clarity creates control. But if you're constantly distracted, you never reach that clarity. You stay in reaction mode, and reaction mode is where money disappears. So the shift is not complicated, but it is uncomfortable. You need to reclaim your attention, not completely, not perfectly, but intentionally. You need moments in your day where there is no noise, no input, no stimulation, just you, your thoughts, your awareness, because in those moments, you reconnect with yourself, you see your patterns, you notice your impulses, you understand your behavior, and that understanding changes everything, because once you become aware, you can no longer act unconsciously. You can no longer pretend you don't see it. And that's powerful, because control doesn't come from force. It comes from awareness, and awareness requires space. So start small. Create pockets of silence, moments where you are not consuming, but observing, not reacting, but reflecting. Because those moments strengthen your mind. They sharpen your awareness. They give you back control over your decisions. And once you have that control, spending becomes intentional, not automatic, directed, not reactive, aligned, not emotional. And that's where real change begins. But there's still something deeper, because even when you reclaim your attention, even when you become more aware, there is still one question that determines everything. What are you actually trying to achieve? Because without a clear direction, without a clear purpose for your money, you will always drift. And drifting leads back to emotional spending. Because when you don't know where you're going, any decision feels acceptable. Any purchase feels justified. Any direction feels fine. And in the next chapter, you're going to uncover why clarity of purpose is the foundation of financial discipline, and how defining what you truly want changes every decision you make. Chapter 15, The Power of Direction. There is a question most people never answer. Not clearly, not honestly, not fully, and because they don't answer it, their money has no direction. And when money has no direction, it follows emotion. That question is simple, but powerful. What am I actually building? Not what you say you want, not what sounds good, not what other people expect, but what you are truly building with your life. Because money is not the goal. It is a tool, and a tool without a purpose gets used randomly, inefficiently, emotionally. That's why so many people feel lost with money. Not because they lack discipline, but because they lack direction. They're not moving towards something. They're just reacting to everything. And reaction always leads back to emotional spending. Because if you don't have a clear destination, every option feels equally valid. Every purchase feels harmless. Every decision feels acceptable. But once you have direction, everything changes, because now you have a filter, a standard, a reference point for every decision. You no longer ask, do I want this? You ask, does this align with what I'm building? And that question eliminates most unnecessary spending immediately, not through force, but through clarity. Because when you know what matters, everything else loses importance. That's the power of direction. It simplifies your decisions. It removes internal conflict. It replaces emotion with intention. But most people avoid this step because defining what you want requires honesty. It requires sitting with yourself without distraction, without noise, without external influence, and asking, what do I actually value? What kind of life am I trying to create? What matters enough for me to sacrifice for it? Because here's the truth, every financial decision is a trade-off. Every dollar you spend is a dollar you don't use for something else. And if you don't choose that something else consciously, it gets chosen for you by your emotions, by your environment, by your habits. That's why clarity is so important, because clarity turns trade-offs into choices, and choices create control. Let's make this practical. Imagine two people with the same income. One has no clear direction. They spend based on feeling, impulse, convenience. The other has a clear goal, a vision, a purpose. They spend based on alignment, progress, intention over time. Those two paths lead to completely different outcomes, not because of income, but because of direction. One drifts, the other builds. And building requires saying no, not occasionally, but consistently. No to distractions. No to unnecessary upgrades. No to emotional decisions that don't serve your long-term vision. And that's not easy, because saying no feels like loss in the moment. But what you gain is far greater. You gain focus. You gain clarity. You gain control over your future because every time you say no to something that doesn't align, you say yes to something that does. That's the shift. From reaction to intention. From impulse to purpose. And once that shift happens, spending becomes simpler. Not because temptation disappears, but because your priorities are stronger. Stronger than the moment, stronger than the emotion, stronger than the urge. And that's where discipline becomes natural, not forced. Because you're not fighting yourself anymore. You're following something clear, something defined, something meaningful, and meaning is more powerful than impulse, always. So take a moment and ask yourself honestly, what am I building? Not what you think you should say, not what sounds impressive, but what is real. Because that answer will guide everything, your spending, your saving, your decisions, your future. And if you don't have that answer yet, that's okay. But don't ignore it, because without it, you will keep drifting, and drifting always leads back to the same place. Emotional spending, temporary relief, long-term frustration, but with direction, everything changes. You stop chasing. You stop reacting. You start building quietly, intentionally, powerfully, and that's where real financial freedom begins. But there's still something deeper, because even with direction, even with clarity, even with awareness, there is still a final layer, the hardest one, the one most people avoid completely. Discipline in action, not in theory, not in understanding, but in real daily decisions. Because knowing what to do is not the same as doing it. And in the next chapter, you're going to learn how to build real discipline, not through motivation, but through systems that make control inevitable. Chapter 16. Discipline that doesn't depend on mood. There is a version of discipline most people believe in, and it's the reason they fail. It's the version that depends on motivation, on feeling ready, on having the right energy, the right mindset, the right moment. And as long as discipline depends on how you feel, it will disappear the moment you need it most. Because feelings change constantly, unpredictably, and emotional spending thrives in those fluctuations. So if you want to break the trap, you cannot rely on discipline that comes and goes. You need something stronger, something more stable. You need systems, because systems don't care how you feel. They run regardless. They protect you when your emotions are high. They guide you when your clarity is low. They create structure when your mind is trying to escape it. Let me make this clear. Discipline is not about forcing yourself in the moment. It's about designing your life in a way that makes the right decision easier and the wrong decision harder. That's the shift from fighting yourself to outsmarting yourself. Because you already know something important. In emotional moments, you don't make your best decisions. So why rely on yourself in those moments? Why not build a system that supports you even when you're not at your best? That's real discipline, not willpower, structure. Let's break it down. If spending is too easy, you will spend. So make it harder. Add friction, not extreme, not restrictive, but intentional. For example, remove saved payment methods. Add a delay before purchases. Separate your spending money from your savings. Create boundaries that force you to pause. Because pause creates awareness, and awareness creates choice. Without that pause, you're just reacting. Now think about this. How many times have you spent money because it was convenient? Because it took seconds? because there was no resistance, that's not discipline failing. That's your environment being too easy. So change the environment, because when you change the environment, you change the behavior. This is what high-level discipline looks like. Not constant self-control, but intelligent design. Designing your life in a way that supports the person you want to become, even when you don't feel like being that person. And here's something powerful. You don't need perfect systems. You need consistent ones, simple rules, clear boundaries, repeatable actions, things you don't have to think about every time, because thinking takes energy. And when your energy is low, your decisions get worse. So reduce the need to think. Automate what you can. Simplify what you can. Structure what you can, so your default behavior aligns with your goals, not your emotions. That's the difference between people who struggle and people who build. One relies on how they feel. The other relies on what they've built. And building takes effort, up front. But once it's in place, it carries you, quietly, consistently, powerfully. And this applies to everything: your spending, your saving, your investing, your habits. Because the goal is not to win one moment. It's to create a system where winning becomes normal, where discipline is not a fight, but a default. And that's when life gets easier, not because things stop being hard, but because your response becomes stronger, more stable, more controlled, and emotional spending loses its power because it no longer has easy access. It no longer has speed. It no longer has control over your decisions. But here's the truth. Even with systems, even with structure, you will still face moments where temptation is strong, where emotions rise, where the urge feels overwhelming. And in those moments, you need something deeper, something internal, something that doesn't depend on systems. You need identity, who you see yourself as, because at the end of the day, you don't act based on what you know. You act based on who you believe you are. And in the next chapter, you're going to uncover how identity shapes every financial decision you make, and why becoming the right person is more powerful than any strategy you follow. Chapter 17. The identity that decides everything. At some point, systems stop being enough. Awareness helps. Structure helps. Discipline helps. But none of it sticks until it becomes part of who you are. Because at the deepest level, you don't act based on what you know. You act based on who you believe you are. Let that sink in. If you see yourself as someone who struggles with money, you will keep proving that belief. If you see yourself as someone who can't control spending, your actions will align with that identity, not because you want them to, but because your mind is wired to stay consistent with who you think you are. That's how identity works. It doesn't just influence behavior, it defines it. This is why people change temporarily, but then fall back, because they changed their actions without changing their identity. And when the pressure returns, the old identity pulls them back, quietly, powerfully, predictably. So if you want real, lasting change, you don't just need new habits. You need a new identity, not a fake one, not something you pretend, but something you build through repeated, intentional action. Because identity is not declared, it's earned, built over time, through consistency, through choices that align with the person you want to become. Let's make this real. Instead of saying, "I'm trying to save money," shift it to, I am someone who controls where my money goes. Feel the difference. One is temporary, the other is identity. One depends on effort, the other defines behavior. Because once you believe something about yourself, your mind works to prove it automatically. If you believe you are disciplined, you will look for ways to act disciplined. If you believe you are intentional, you will naturally question impulsive decisions. But if you believe you are emotional with money, you will justify emotional behavior again and again. So the real question is not, what should I do differently? It's, who do I need to become? Because becoming changes everything. It changes how you think, how you decide, how you respond under pressure. It changes what feels natural, what feels uncomfortable, what feels acceptable. And once your identity shifts, discipline becomes easier. Not because the world changes, but because you do. Now here's the key. You don't wait to feel like that person. You act like that person first, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it feels unnatural. Because identity is built through evidence. Every time you make a disciplined decision, you give yourself proof. Proof that you are becoming someone different. And that proof compounds slowly, quietly, but powerfully, until one day it's no longer effort. It's who you are. And that's when emotional spending loses its grip, because it no longer matches your identity. It feels off, out of alignment, not because you're forcing yourself, but because it's not you anymore. That's the goal, not control through force, but alignment through identity. And this applies to everything, not just spending, but saving, investing, building. Because the strongest financial position is not built by someone trying to be disciplined. It's built by someone who sees discipline as part of who they are. And that difference is everything. But here's where it gets deeper. Because identity is not just internal. It's reinforced by your actions, daily, repeatedly. And if your actions don't match your desired identity, your mind will reject it. So you have to be honest. You have to look at your behavior and ask, is this aligned with who I want to become? Not perfectly, but consistently, because consistency builds identity, not perfection. Small decisions, repeated over time. That's what shapes you. That's what defines you. That's what determines your future. And once you understand that, you stop looking for shortcuts. You stop looking for quick fixes. You start focusing on alignment, on becoming, on building something real. Because real change is not loud. It's not dramatic. It's not instant. It's quiet, steady, intentional. And it shows up in moments no one sees. The moments where you could spend, but you don't. The moments where you pause, where you think, where you choose differently. That's where identity is built. Not in what you say, but in what you do. And over time, those moments define everything. But there's still one final shift, because even with identity, even with discipline, even with awareness, there is still one thing that determines whether you truly break free or fall back into the same cycle. Consistency over time. Because change is not about one decision. It's about thousands of small ones made again and again, even when no one is watching. And in the next chapter, you're going to understand how to build consistency that lasts, and why most people fail, not because they can't change, but because they can't sustain it. Chapter 18, the discipline of staying consistent. There's a hard truth most people avoid. They don't fail because they don't understand. They fail because they don't continue. Because Consistency is where everything breaks. Not in the beginning, not when motivation is high, not when everything feels clear and possible, but later, when the excitement fades, when the results are slow, when the effort feels repetitive. That's where most people stop. And the moment they stop, the old patterns return. Quietly, quickly. Because emotional spending is not waiting for you to be weak. It's waiting for you to be inconsistent. Because inconsistency reopens the door. You skip one day of awareness, one moment of discipline, one decision where you say, "It's fine." And that's all it takes. Not to destroy everything, but to weaken your structure. And once the structure weakens, the old habits slip back in. That's why consistency is not about perfection. It's about continuity, about staying connected to the process, even when you don't feel like it. Because the truth is, you will not feel like it most of the time. You won't feel like pausing. You won't feel like questioning your impulses. You won't feel like choosing the harder option. But that's exactly when it matters. Because consistency is not built in easy moments. It's built in resistant ones. The moments where your mind says, "Not today," and you respond, "Still today." That's power. That's growth. That's how identity becomes real. Not through big changes, but through repeated small decisions made when it's inconvenient. Because convenience creates comfort, but discomfort creates transformation. And most people never reach transformation because they stop at comfort. They want change, but only when it feels easy. And emotional spending feeds that. It offers easy relief, quick satisfaction, immediate reward, while discipline asks for patience, delay, consistency without instant results. That's why it's hard, but that's also why it works. Because anything that requires consistency filters out the people who are not committed. And if you want to break the emotional spending trap, you have to become someone who stays, not someone who starts. Anyone can start. Few people continue. And continuation is what creates results. So how do you build that? You simplify your process. You remove complexity. Because complex systems fail under pressure. Simple ones survive. You don't need 10 rules. You need a few clear ones. Repeatable, understandable, sustainable. Things you can follow, even when your energy is low. Because low energy is when consistency matters most. That's when habits take over. That's when your system either supports you or collapses. So build something you can maintain. Not something that looks impressive, but something that actually works. And here's something important. Track your behavior, not to judge yourself, but to stay aware. Because what gets tracked gets managed, and what gets ignored gets repeated. So don't let your actions disappear into memory. Make them visible. Because visibility creates accountability, and accountability creates consistency, even if it's just for yourself. Now here's the deeper truth. Consistency is not just about action. It's about recovery. Because you will slip. You will make decisions that don't align. You will have moments where you fall back into old patterns. That's not failure. That's part of the process. The difference is, do you stop there or do you return? Because consistency is not about never breaking. It's about never staying broken. You come back quickly, without overthinking, without guilt, without turning one mistake into a pattern. Because that's what most people do. They make one bad decision, and then they say, "Well, I already messed up." And that mindset creates more damage than the original mistake. So change that. One decision does not define you, but repeated decisions do. So focus on the next one, always the next one, because the next decision is where your power is, not in the past, not in what you already did, but in what you do next. That's where consistency lives, in the present, moment by moment, choice by choice. And if you stay connected to that, you build momentum. And momentum makes everything easier because once you're moving in the right direction, it takes less effort to continue. But the hardest part is staying consistent long enough to feel that shift. Most people quit right before it happens, right before discipline becomes natural, right before awareness becomes automatic, right before control becomes effortless. They stop, and they never experience what's possible. But if you stay, if you push through that phase, everything changes, because what was once difficult becomes normal. What was once effort becomes identity. And that's when emotional spending loses its hold completely. But there's one final layer, because even with consistency, even with identity, even with discipline, there is still one thing that determines whether you truly stay free or slowly fall back into the trap: your long-term vision. Because without a vision that keeps you focused, even the strongest systems eventually weaken. And in the next chapter, you're going to discover how to build a vision so clear, so strong, that it pulls you forward, even when your emotions try to pull you back. Chapter 19, The Vision That Pulls You Forward. There is a difference between pushing yourself and being pulled by something stronger. Most people try to push. They rely on effort, on discipline, on forcing themselves to do the right thing, and that works for a while. But pushing is exhausting because you're constantly fighting against something, against temptation, against emotion, against habit, and eventually you get tired, you slow down, you slip, and the cycle begins again. But there is another way, a more powerful way. Instead of pushing yourself forward, you build something that pulls you forward. A vision, not a vague idea, not a general goal, but something clear, specific, emotional, something that matters enough to override your impulses. Because when your vision is strong, discipline becomes easier, not effortless, but easier. And if you want to go deeper, if you want more audiobooks like this, more clarity, more structure, more tools to build yourself, then subscribe, not as a click, but as a commitment to keep showing up, to keep learning, to keep growing. Because consistency is built through repetition, and repetition starts with showing up again and again and again. And if you know someone who is stuck in this cycle, someone who earns but never builds, share this with them, because sometimes one realization is all it takes to change everything. And before we close, there's one final line I want you to carry with you. Something simple, something real, something you can return to whenever you feel that urge, that pull, that moment before the decision. Here it is. You don't need more money to feel in control. You need more control to keep your money. Hold on to that, because if you do, you won't just change how you spend. You'll change how you live, and that changes everything.